Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Linda Farb, the chair of the Coalition Against Global Genocide, and it's my honor and privilege to be with you tonight to introduce our host for this event, Dr. Tim Kubik. And I want to say that Tim, who is the past chair of the Coalition Against Global Genocide, is now an honorary board member. He's a graduate of Yale and Johns Hopkins University with a doctorate in German history and political theory. Dr. Kubik now works to promote community-connected, authentic learning experiences around the world, including COAGG's Changing the Script program for 6th through 12th grade students. And I'm very happy to see Tim tonight. So welcome, everyone. Tim?
All right, thank you for that kind introduction, Linda, and it is good to see you again. It's been a long time since we've all been down in Denver together. I'm coming to you all from Northern Colorado, in Berthoud, Colorado, and I want to start by just giving a really brief background on the coalition itself. Our mission has always been to educate, motivate, and empower individuals and communities to oppose genocide and crimes against humanity. That first started back in 2006, working on the genocide in Sudan. But in 2018, as a result of some questions that had surfaced in the decade of work we did, we convened a roundtable that featured one of our guests, Dr. Alfonzo Porter, on the question of genocide and slavery with the African American community. And in that roundtable, the first of its kind in the country, actually, we focused on questions about awareness and prevention, reconciliation, and reparations. And that was very well received. We did that at the Auraria campus in Denver. And so in 2019, the coalition again chose to honor the 400th anniversary of slavery, or recognize more than honor it, by convening a screening of a film, Slavery and the Making of America, by award-winning filmmaker Dante James. Again, positive reception. And so this year, the plan had been to go ahead and do another conference of the sort we did in 2018. But as many conferences planned, COVID intervened. And so instead of doing a face-to-face conference, we opted for this webinar series, What If Democracy Fails? It's my privilege to be able to introduce our two speakers, and we'll get started then in a moment. The first is Dr. Alfonzo Porter, and you can see his lengthy bio there. I'll hit some of the highlights rather than read that out to you. He's a career educator and an educational leader, founder of Vertex Learning, excuse me, another education consultancy, but he's also been a very active journalist and is a professor at Metro State in Denver on the Auraria campus. And we're really honored that as a result of our collaborations over the last couple of years, Dr. Porter joined us on the board of COAGG last year. Our second speaker tonight, Dr. Pius Kamau, has been a career physician. Born originally in Kenya, he then came to the United States to study and became a surgeon. Like Dr. Porter, he is a journalist and an author, but also a very active community nonprofit organizer for the benefit of the African American community and US-Africa relations. So it's my privilege to introduce both of these speakers. They'll be the focus of the dialogue this evening. But before we start, I want to make two acknowledgments. The first, that I also have a privilege to acknowledge as a white academic asked to moderate a dialogue among two of my Black colleagues. I've really worked with them to try to ensure that my moderation amplifies their voices rather than moderates it in the way that term can sometimes be used. And I hope those efforts will prove successful tonight. The second thing is that we are on the eve of an anniversary that is important to all Americans. And while we're asking the question, what if democracy fails? I think it is important that we take a moment to remember September 11th, tomorrow, with a brief moment of silence before we begin our dialogue. And with that, thank you. I want to welcome everybody to our conversation. The series is entitled, What If Democracy Fails? And I'd like to give both Dr. Kamau and Dr. Porter a few minutes, and by that I emphasize a few, 3 to 4 each, to respond to that opening prompt. We've seen the resurgence of authoritarian governments worldwide, with democracies in Eastern Europe, South Asia, South America, all have taken a turn to democratic rule. In Germany, the far-right AfD party is showing numbers similar to that posted by the Nazi Party in the late 20s. And in the US, our democracy is being tested by an extreme climate of political polarization. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Porter or Dr. Kamau, who'd ever like to go first. What if democracy fails?
Thank you very much, Tim. And I'd like to start with a basic overview, and then we'll get obviously into the more weighty subject of what if democracy fails, and talk about the rise of white supremacy as a component of this. White supremacy is the #1 threat to the United States today, according to Homeland Security, and this is information that we're receiving today. The individual who told us this is now under duress and threat by the current administration, has been demoted within the organization. So let's not be tepid about it. America has always been a terrorist nation for African Americans. We have never had to look abroad for those who sought to demean us in any way possible. So we did not need ISIS or Al Qaeda or the Taliban to be fearful of. The nation was founded on white supremacist ideas that one group is inherently more superior than the other. The founders of the country, in all those glorious pronouncements that all men are created equal, freedom and justice for all, right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all owned human beings. In fact, Article 1, Section 2 of the US Constitution defined my ancestors as 3/5 of a free person to be bought and sold at will. There's a white supremacist in the White House at this time who encourages and incites racial hate and animus, whether praising neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, supporting police violence against unarmed African Americans, or defending an underage gunman who crossed state lines and murdered 2 people. His attitude is clear and his goals are evident. He is hell-bent on fanning the flames of hate and division. The suggestion that peaceful protesters are criminals, but armed gunmen at the state capitol are patriots sends an unmistakable message. I support white supremacy. His followers are information consumers who regurgitate his word for word. Incapable of critical thought, they follow blindly as if mesmerized by a cult leader promising to lead them to glory. The president plays the fear, hate, anger, and blame card, all the key aspects of effective propaganda, to further indoctrinate his followers. This danger is real, and it is clear and present. 4 more years of Donald Trump, and this American democracy will no longer exist. His blatant disrespect for the rule of law will be further emboldened if allowed to steal the 2020 election. What's ironic is that he is incapable of caring or empathy. Those who he purports to support are merely pawns in his wicked game. Their lives do not matter either. If he tells them to attend a rally in the middle of a pandemic and sign a death waiver to exempt him from legal action, is still not enough to convince them that he does not care about them. The rise of white supremacy under Donald Trump is more urgent than ever. And let me just finish with this. We are seeing the dismantling of our democracy brick by brick by this individual. He has defied the Supreme Court. He has undermined the authority of Congress. He has weaponized the Justice Department, and he is manipulating intelligence data for his own political ends. And if that is not the beginning of the end of democracy, we have a long conversation tonight. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Porter. Turning to Dr. Kamau, what if democracy fails? Your thoughts on this series overview question?
Yeah, it's an ocean of a question because there's so much so being included in that question, really. The first thing that I would like to do is to have two quotations, one from Shakespeare and one from Churchill. Shakespeare, Cassius, talking to Brutus, says, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." And then the good old Churchill, 1947, in the House of Commons, said, "No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." The point of my quoting that, especially the Churchill one, is to merely say that the concept of democracy is an evolving one, it would seem, and that, as one remembers from history, and we have a historian here as our panel, as our our referee, is a historian of German history. And in essence, then, when you go back to the Greeks, I mean, democracy was, began in Athens, but really it was only for the freed men. Women could not participate, and slaves did not participate. Of course, you come to 1776 and a Declaration of Independence, where we sort of began our quote unquote democracy. Well, blacks like me were not included in it. Women were not really. So in essence, it's not an ideal form of governance at all. And so my point is, we have continued to sort of try to get more rights for people. And so when we say, is democracy going to fail? Well, actually, democracy never really attained its sort of the point where it could actually be a perfect union, so to speak. We are continually sort of trying to be a more perfect union. That said, you cannot have a democracy when you have 17% of our citizens not included. By that I mean 14.7% blacks and about 2% Native Americans. They have not been included. And as we know, until the 1920s, white women were not included. So essentially, democracy has not been functioning in America. But that said, we have to continue to struggle. We have to continue to fight. There's no question that we are in a tough position now, where you have white supremacists are trying to sort of take the little rights that we all have, and that has to be fought. That has to be fought, and all of us in this moment have to redouble our efforts and to fight as much as we can. In a little bit, I think we should say something about Black Lives Matter and where we go from there. But I think maybe for the moment I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kamau, for that opening remark. And yes, these opening remarks from our two speakers were designed to sort of frame the series. And there are 3 more talks after tonight's that we hope you'll join. I'll announce the next one coming up toward the end of this. But that initial question, what if democracy fails, is meant to frame some of the other questions that we'll take up. And the topic of white supremacy is the question that we're taking up tonight. And I've tried to break that down into 2 questions based on some suggestions from our 2 speakers that I think will help make this meaningful. And in terms of the format for those 2 blocks, we're going to hear from our speakers for a while, and then we'll open things up to question and answer on each question for about 10 minutes so that the audience has a chance to ask them some questions. And you can type those questions in chat, And you should have the ability to vote up or down on whether you think those are questions that our panelists should answer. And those that get the most sort of votes will be questions that I will field to the panelists. And if the panelists have time, they may offer short answers to some of the questions that don't get voted up so that we get them taken care of that way. Regardless, we'll be thinking about all the questions that are captured in our Q&A session tonight. So I'd like to go ahead and jump into the next question, which is, what does the resurgence of white supremacy mean for American society? Dr. Porter mentioned the recent Department of Homeland Security report that came out this week, stating that white supremacist terrorism is by far and away the greatest threat to American society. That report has been released pretty much every year since 2006, when the first Bush administration suppressed it. And then during the Obama administration sort of dared not touch it as a Black president receiving information about white supremacy. And now we see the current administration sort of turning away from it as well. But it nonetheless, when our own government is telling us that it may be a serious issue, and when the Anti-Defamation League ranked Colorado third in the nation for white supremacist propaganda, this is a question that we really need to take up as Americans about our society. Whether we're talking about swastikas in Evergreen, burning the home of a Sudanese family in Aurora, or just yesterday's National Socialist pamphleteering against Black Lives Matter in Colorado Springs that literally featured pictures of police officers with knees on African-American necks and nooses. What does the resurgence of white supremacy mean for us as an American society? Dr. Porter, I'll give you the lead on this one.
Thank you, Tim. I am extremely concerned that the dog whistles have now become full-out bullhorn messages in support of white supremacy and white supremacist ideas. Obviously, white supremacy had never gone away. It had just gone into hiding. And now it has a proponent. And it is creating an extremely dangerous situation that when peaceful protesters are now being framed as leftist terrorists, yet the people who are murdering unarmed civilians are being told that they are very fine people, sends a clear, unadulterated message that there is widespread support from the highest office in the land for violence, hate, and a dismantling of social norms and our society in general. This is the most dangerous thing that I've witnessed in my lifetime. And I do believe that we must do everything we can to address it. Now, I'm hoping that we'll have an opportunity to kind of talk about some solutions and some action steps in that direction. But this is the most frightful thing that I've witnessed. And clearly, my ancestors, and obviously I was born in Jim Crow America, not free. I'm the same age as President Obama. And so that whole separate but equal notion, I mean, throughout that period, we were being terrorized by marauding thugs in white sheets, terrorizing our homes and our family members. Any suggestion of a return to anything like that will tilt this very fragile peace in this society into chaos. And I believe, and I'm fearful that once it starts, we won't be able to contain it.
All right, thank you. We will get back to some questions about solutions once we spend a little time framing what we see as some of the issues with white supremacy's resurgence in American society. Dr. Kamau, I'll turn it over to you. What do you see as the impact of the resurgence of white supremacy for American society broadly understood?
So let me first of all go back a little bit and explain that I come from Africa, from Kenya,
Mm-hmm.
and Kenya was under the British until 1962, between 1950 and 1960, we had the Mau Mau rebellion war. And essentially for about 90 years, the colonialists really held us, held Africans as nothing. We had no rights whatsoever. We were third-rate citizens, really. It doesn't mean that that we can never ever compare ourselves to to what American blacks have gone through. There's no way. But we had a taste of the cruelty I hate to use this word, of the white man. I mean, the terrorism that some people are capable of is truly awful. But what happened in America? Something very interesting happened, especially over the last from 9/11, for example. We have spent a tremendous amount of money, a tremendous amount of wealth, national wealth, chasing Al-Qaeda and chasing Arab terrorists. Well, it so happens that we were growing our own terrorists here, in this soil. And what's happened, of course, is that after the Syrian crisis, is that we had millions of Middle Easterners go to Europe, as you remember. In Germany absorbed about 1 million Syrians, for example. Mm-hmm. And that in itself began to seed the so-called populist white nationalism, for example. And the point I'm trying to get at is something quite interesting that has happened around the world, which is the so-called white nationalists in Germany, in France, and in Italy, somehow have been working together. They become a force now. And guess what? The one group, the one person, the people that are really sort of getting them together and helping them is white Russians. We spent billions and billions of dollars fighting the Cold War. And suddenly now, white Russians are our buddies. It's like you turn the world upside down altogether. So my point is this: that we have to be aware of these things. It's growing, and closing our eyes to it will not help it. It's the white supremacists are here. They we have a representative, I'm sorry, in the White House, so we have a problem. It's like, Houston, we have a problem. What are we going to do about it? And I think maybe we can sort of present a few answers and a few solutions to what we all need to do. But each one of us has to do something as individuals and as a society.
And we'll take up that question about what this means for us as individuals as our second part of the conversation in a little bit later. Couple things that I've seen floating in conversations in our sidebars, Q&A or from other folks. And I think something that both of you mentioned is if you can comment something about our rejection of separate but equal as an American society, and how we seem to be backsliding on that again. And what are the implications of that? What are the implications if, unlike what Barack Obama said in 2006, there aren't two Americas, there's just one America? What happens to an American society in which there are 2, 3, or 4 Americas that are segregated along principles of white supremacy? What happens to us as a country?
I don't think that we really ever emerged from the separate but equal idea. We became a little bit more equal, but did not enjoy full equality in the United States. One thing that we should be mindful of, and that is back during the Civil Rights era, the biggest threat to America was communism. And so the idea and the labeling of Dr. King and members of the civil rights community as communists sent fear throughout the nation. But the reality is that as Black people in the United States, we never lived in a democracy. We lived in a communist context within a constitutional democracy. And thereby, I want to submit that if you assume that communism, the ideology supports what is good for the community and what is good for all, without the pretext of capitalism and getting rich, that under communism, your life is essentially determined, that what the community needs is what role you will fulfill. That is the condition in which we lived for several centuries. And so the idea, I think, is ironic and hypocritical to suggest that African Americans might be communists. How could we not be communists? Because that's the reality in which we live. So the whole separate but equal idea it looked good on the 8x10 glossies, but never manifested really. And so when I say that this is a very dangerous era, it means that I believe that we could very easily slip back into those conditions.
Which would put the United States in some sort of civil war against itself by design, basically. So thank you for that perspective. Dr. Kamau, what about you on this, this notion of partial, separate, but equal being realized, and now we seem to be backsliding against it? What do you see as the consequence for our society if we fall back into a society that accepts separate but equal, or perhaps even separate and unequal?
Well, as Dr. Porter was saying, we never were equal. You know, I mean, we have been separate. Not we. I mean, America has been separate, and America has been unequal. Let me give you a very short example. For example, as a surgeon, my patients sort of had came into batches. For example, the insured and uninsured. And insured, unfortunately, tended to be minority. Or true, there were some whites, I mean, who are uninsured, but the majority of my patients were uninsured. You know, were people of color and Hispanics. I mean, in that already in healthcare, you are not equal. And of course, I mean, then we go back to education. Our educational system is not equal, will never be equal, as long as the financing of education depends on our real estate. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry. So when you begin with education, then healthcare. I mean, right there. I mean, you're dealing with two societies. I think it's also worthwhile mentioning that our Christian religion is not equal. I mean, in fact, I consider Christianity in America as Christian capitalism. Because I mean, essentially, I mean, it's a religion that encourages and wants us to be rich. The richer we are, clearly, unfortunately, I mean, in there we have a division between black and white, of course. You know. When you have 1% of Americans own 40% of wealth, and the 40% of the bottom own only 1%, how could you ever be equal? If even pretend that you can be equal. So in other words, I submit to you that the notion that equality is going to happen in our lifetime, or in the next two or three lifetimes, is preposterous and I think a dream. But a good dream, though. We all have to dream, and we have to sort of aim to try our very, very best to try to arrive to that parity, or at least some kind of parity. And we can begin today.
Yes. Well, I thank you for those very clear examples I think that's something that we want to be mindful of, is that we already have multiple Americas, and the gaps are getting wider, whether it's around income, certainly around education. Since two of us on this conversation are educators, I can't help but mention Jonathan Kozel's work, Savage Inequalities, about the incredible disparities that often exist between two districts that are right next to each other, and about the way that in most states, school district boundaries are incredibly stacked up with legislative boundaries that privilege white suburban districts over other districts in their communities. There is a system that creates these multiple Americas. White supremacy, it would seem, is about silencing some of those multiple Americas again. And a question that came in earlier that I want to come back to is, comment, either one of you, if you would, on the impact on American society of suspending many of the Voting Rights Act's protections a few years ago that the Supreme Court did in overturning the 1965 Voting Rights Act. How is that related to white supremacy and an impact on American society? And that'll probably be our last sort of conversation point before we take some general questions from the audience. So both of you have a shot at that.
Sure, I think it goes directly to the heart of the conversation, that if you take away the primary tool of a democracy, and that is to be able to cast your ballot for school board member, mayor, president, congressional representative, then slide back very dangerously into the conditions that we had just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
To add to that, though, I am a fan of Kozel's work. And in that book, Savage Inequalities, he talked about school choice and school choice.
Mm-hmm.
And in which case, he kind of broke down into gradations of particular schools and the expectations of those schools. And so you, on the one hand, had the low-income school, where the idea was that you would go into a service industry. And those are essentially the kinds of schools that dot our communities. You then have a middle-class school where you might get a community college education and you may become a quasi-professional of some sort. You then had the affluent professional school where you would then get a university credential and you would go into a profession. And then you had the executive elite school, wherein you would then become a leader in society and industry. And we still have that. And so, as you mentioned, Tim, we've slid back to the same equal idea where the nation is desegregating right before our eyes. And the courts have stopped taking up the lawsuits to address that.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about the diminution of the Voting Rights Act, it all ties together. And with education and the sliding back and desegregation, the resegregation of the country, it all adds together. But I would like to pose another question, and that is, the larger question is, what will we do if, in fact, this continues? Should we continue to stage peaceful protests in the wake of violence being propagated against us? That is the larger question, because I'm fearful that we have reached a generation that will not listen to peaceful protest much longer.
Mm-hmm. And that is definitely a question that I'm sure will come up in our second topic question about what individuals can do. Dr. Kamau, I'll give you a chance to chime in on this question of what impact does the removal of many of the Voting Rights Act's protections have on exacerbating white supremacy in American society?
Well, I think the best way to illustrate that is to give examples of where, for example, because African Americans have been able to be elected to some offices, they have been able to carry out some things that were not done for a very long time. One of them is the district attorney, the DA in Dallas. was a black man who was elected. It's interesting the number of people in jail, in prisons, that were innocent, and he was able to actually get them freed because they could be proven to have been innocent and to be imprisoned for no reason at all. So clearly, the fact that you stop people like that being elected, it's impacting the black population. It's also true of Stacey Evans, for example, in Georgia. I think she had more votes, I think, than the governor of Georgia at this particular moment. But you know how many people were taken off the rolls by the governor. So you'd have had a black woman be the governor of Georgia. And then, so we can go on and on and on. The whole of the South American South has been a place where blacks have not been able to vote because their rights have been taken away. And then I think one more example that I wanted to give our listeners is in Belarus at this moment. Lubchenko, for example. He pretended. You sort of imagine that he had 80% of the vote. Of course, he stole the election. That's an example of how important it is that we should have a representative government, and the people, in America, I think may begin doing what the people are doing in Belarus now. One last point, which Alfonso just mentioned, which is, what do we do if this continues? And I posit a question to all of you, which is, what is wrong with being anti-fascist?
A good question to end on. Yes. I could go on that for a long time, but it's not my place to do so. What I'd like to do now is to give our audience a chance to post a few questions that they may have about any of the topics that we've discussed regarding the resurgence of white supremacy in American society. Or if you feel there's a question that we've missed in this topic, knowing that we're going to take up what it means for us as individuals in a moment, what are some thoughts that you have that you'd like to ask before we move on? So I'm just going to give our speakers a moment to catch a breath, get a drink of water, and see if any new questions come up in the Q&A. Any new questions from the audience at this time? If you want to go to Q&A, there is one other question that came up a little earlier that I'll just pitch to both of you briefly before we wrap this section. And that is the role of firearms in the resurgence of white supremacy, the role of guns, right? How does that have a bigger impact on American society, that we see the fragmentary cultures in America taking up arms to defend a part of an American vision rather than the larger society? Any thoughts on that question?
We're beginning to now hear that if President Trump loses, we're going to take up arms, this kind of thing. It's very disconcerting. We're seeing armed militia storm Capitol buildings around the country under this Liberate Michigan and Liberate Ohio and all of these machinations. But on the other side, we're also seeing armed Black militia coming out who are just as armed to protect protesters. This is a powder keg, and we simply need one spark, and we will find ourselves in conditions that we cannot contain without turning the US military on the American public, which of course this president has already demonstrated that he is willing to do. So it may well play directly into his hands, and that may in fact be what he is hoping will transpire. But I think guns at a protest that is peaceful it simply creates a powder keg that will blow up on all of us.
Thank you. Dr. Kamau, thoughts on that question about the armed nature of many of the white supremacist groups?
Well, I think it's evil. I mean, I think it's awful. I think the whole concept of guns and this notion that the Second Amendment gives everybody a right to arm themselves to the nth degree, I think is foolish. But then a lot of things about America are very foolish, and I hate to say that. I mean, when 51 people were killed in New Zealand, the first thing that the did was ban all guns, and the populace. I mean, it didn't squawk at all. I mean, the NRA is in big trouble right now, as you know. Mr. LaPierre has been using the NRA funds as a kitty for his. But in any case, I do not wish them well. I mean, I do hope that the New York Attorney General can shut NRA up altogether. But will that change the situation of guns in America? I don't think so, because I mean, we are afloat. We're a country afloat with guns. There's so many AR-15s, and we don't know what to do with them. So the question is, I mean, what's going to happen if our current president loses the election? I think we have to go to the barricades. I think. I mean, I really actually see that happening at the end of this year. So we have to be prepared. I'm sorry.
Might I suggest too?
Sure.
It's going to jump in. We are, obviously we have a right to bear arms, but that law was written at a different time and place than we are right now. There are more guns in the United States than actual citizens of the country. And the idea that we would overturn the Second Amendment and then try to confiscate guns will in and of itself lead to insurrection. So sensible gun reform, and as you mentioned, Kamau, the NRA has been found to be disingenuous at best. And so we should, I think, seize the moment to enact reasonable, common sense gun reform. You don't need an AR-15 to go hunting, and you don't need an AR-15, to protect your family. And so why do we have military-style weaponry that is allowed on American streets in the hands of American citizens?
May I interject at a point, please, Tim?
Yes, of course.
Or merely that when I came to the United States, I mean, I was really surprised, that people were carrying guns to protect themselves. I often wondered, who are you protecting yourself from? I mean, do I need to protect myself from my neighbor? I mean, it's like, I mean, it didn't make no sense at all to me. Well, it still doesn't. But most of the world, I mean, does not carry guns the way Americans, or view guns the way Americans do. And to me, it's totally crazy. But they're just me.
Well, it's a very difficult conversation to bring up. We're lucky that we're all on Zoom and are talking to each other from a distance and not staring each other down in the street where one side is armed and one side is not. But I think you're both right to point out the way that this exacerbates the tensions. And I liked, Dr. Porter, your use of the language of a powder keg, right? Because I do think that's what it feels like for those who've been on the streets in Denver or elsewhere around the community or around the country. The questions that we're getting from the audience are moving more toward our second topic. So I think we'll close this question of what it means for American society. If I can share my screen here for a moment. We'll switch to the question of, well, what does it mean for me as an individual American? I want to say that Dr. Kamau rightly said that full equality is a dream, but it's a dream worth keeping. And I think most of us know that those dreams only come true when some of us as individuals get into good trouble. And that's a fine line to walk, what's good trouble and what's not. I want to take a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent article in Vanity Fair to kick off this question. It's a short piece. I'd recommend taking a look at it. And he opined that the question of the day for Americans is not only will the protesters vote, but will the voters continue to protest? If we don't do both of those things, if we don't vote and we don't protest, there's not going to be much change, because as we talked about already, voting districts tend to sort of solidify, and we know that gerrymandering and other things makes it hard for the vote to make as big of a difference as it might. But as we think about this question, I'm going to go to Dr. Kamau first in this round, if that's okay, Alfonso, since you had the responsibility for leading in the first round. We'll let Dr. Kamau take that one. What does it mean as an individual as we face rising or resurgent white supremacy? What does it mean for us as individual Americans, Dr. Kamau? What are your thoughts about some solutions, some actions, consequences if we don't act, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's something I've been pondering for quite a while. What is it? What's the responsibility of the individual? And I think what we have to do is a full engagement. I think we have to be. There is a tendency in America to forget. We go in segments. You know, at this moment, this is the problem, and we deal with that, and we don't imagine that the problem has been solved and taken care of, forgetting that it's a continuum. That which happened 20 years ago is still happening today, even though we forgot about it. So the point I'm trying to make is I think each one of us is responsible and has to engage and engage fully. Now, it's not for me to say what it is that we have to engage in. I mean, we are intelligent people. I think we know if it means marching, we need to continue marching. If we need to help people with healthcare, we need to help them. We need to help people with education, children with education. We need to somehow make this America a more equal society. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things which I can suggest, but at this moment, I think we all have to sort of think what it is that we can do, what we are able to do. Those of us who can run, those who can teach, those who can sing, those who can fly. You know, we have to do what we are capable of doing, but do it and fully engaged. It's imperative.
I like that mantra of everyone offering their own talents, and we'll get back to some of the ways to do that in answer to some specific questions in the question and answer portion of this bit. Dr. Porter, what does it mean for us as American individuals facing the resurgence or the emboldening of white supremacy in America?
Well, I don't want to sound naive, but I do think that dialogue at some level would be a reasonable idea. Certainly, if individuals can be taught hate, can it be untaught? And can there be some interventions to address whatever the grievances of those who want to take up the mantra of white supremacy? Because as I mentioned, by and large, these individuals are low information consumers. Ostensibly, they're waiting to be told what to think. Mm-hmm. And the components of propaganda as a journalist are rooted in fear, anger, blame. It's somebody else's fault for the conditions in my life. Therefore, I'm angry and I want revenge and I want my country back, and we keep hearing these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. At some point, we're going to have to engage in some level of dialogue. Whether it's possible or not, I'm not sure, but I think that certainly on one side there is a willingness to engage. But again, because individuals have been consumed in propaganda and believe in the fiber of them, how much can we really expect for them to hear if this has been ingrained so deeply? But I do hold out that dialogue at some level is needed.
Tim, if I may just add a quick point, which essentially is there's a lot of loneliness we are a very lonely nation, and a lot of lonely people gather in this internet groups, and they talk to each other, and you have a continuous loop of whatever it is that is being said, and so. And of course, then we have a TV station that does the same thing too. So they all get into the same information loop. So we do need to somehow find a way to cut that vicious cycle.
So I think you both raised some very important points that get to some of the questions that are surfacing. There's a significant difference between the exchange of information and dialogue. And both of you do a lot of work in the larger community, whether it's as a mentor, whether it's as an organizer, and have a lot of experience, I assume, with having to balance that combination of, I need to get you certain information, but I want to do it in a way that is a dialogue with you rather than a lecture. Can you talk a little bit about your own experience in talking with perhaps not someone who's overtly a white supremacist, but someone who is benefiting from white privilege in a way that is not hearing what you're laying down? How do you try to make that a dialogue rather than just a delivery?
So let me go first. So I have. As I said, I mean, I was a surgeon for many years, and I don't know how many of you know surgeons well, especially American surgeons, but I can assure you that it's one of the most conservative group of people that you ever want to encounter. So for about 30-40 years, I mean, I've been dealing with people that they simply could not understand where I was coming from, and vice versa. I mean, I just could not understand. So I do have a couple of friends, and we have known each other for years and years, and we talk. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, there are some things we sort of stop talking about. They're subjects we simply are outside of the discussion. Now, the thing is, do I like them as human beings? I do. I like them as my friends. But I mean, there's a point where you simply, after 10 years, you stop. Another example that I may also want to give you is I had a patient that I saw who had been in a motor vehicle accident. And this 19-year-old boy was throwing up blood. And I was going to see him. So I went to his room, and once he saw there was a black man, he did not want me to see him. Of course, I mean, when I looked at his chest, he had a swastika painted on his chest. So the point is, I mean, we communicated, but we communicated through other people. So there's communication, but there are different ways of communication. You can have a wall between the conversants, for example, and find a way to sort of get your message across.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those examples, Dr. Kamau. Dr. Porter, your thoughts about how we move from delivery of information or our points of view to genuine dialogue?
Well, again, I think as a journalist, our job is to convey fact-based information. That is designed so that people can make informed decisions about their lives. That is the First Amendment. First Amendment for a reason, because a democracy cannot survive without a free and independent press. And so we have seen this wholesale assault on the First Amendment by this president, even to the point of calling the free press enemy of the people, which seems to be right out of the Vladimir Putin handbook. But communication it's linear. And if I'm the conveyor of the information, then the receiver of the information has to be receptive to what I'm saying. I think the part of that solution is attempting to find out the source or the root of the fear, the hate, and the anger. Are you angry and you fearful because somebody told you that you ought to be? Mm-hmm. Are you fearful and angry because you've experienced things in your life? So that therefore, if you tell me that you've never interfaced with an African American, then how can you possibly have fear, hate, and anger? And so I think it really, many of the answers can be found, I think, at the very beginning of it in the dialogue. But again, somehow we've got to make sure that the receiver is receptive to what the conveyor of the information is trying to offer. It's a tall order.
No, it is a tall order. I think that's a very good point, though, right? And oftentimes we tend to, I don't disagree with the notion that many of the white supremacist groups are low information citizens, right? That doesn't necessarily mean they aren't having genuine experiences that need to be understood, whether it's fear or anger or what have you. And I think that notion that the audience needs to be receptive is an important one, right? And I think there are maybe some ways that we can work on that. I know one of the challenges that I'm sensing in the chat, in the Q&A that's going on, and it's a challenge that we feel in all manners of social life, is sort of the challenge between dealing with individuals who are reliant on white privilege as a part of their personal identity, right? Versus dealing with individuals who are unconsciously reliant on white privilege as a systemic cultural artifact that they benefit from. Any thoughts about how to address those two different types of audiences? One who is feeling very much, hey, like I'm white and I'm proud, and one that is just sort of unaware of the privilege that they gain from their background. Thoughts on that either one of you would share on differentiating the message for those two different groups?
Well, I mentioned the group of physicians that I was talking about, and when we say that the listener has to be receptive to the messages, well, I mean, it's, a lot of people are really not interested. I mean, it's like I don't care to hear what you're saying. So you have a group of, and I believe that that's so true of a lot of America, white America, at any rate. It really does not see an advantage to getting to know, somebody who is not white, who is not their class, or they don't go to the same clubs, or etc. Now, so our job, I think, is our job, you, me, we who are willing, to sort of find people who are receptive to the messages of enlightenment, if we can use that word, because that's essentially what's going to happen. We will have to talk to each other. We will have to break bread. We will have to visit each other in our homes. But you see what I'm trying to say.
I do, and I'm glad you raised that last point about breaking bread together. That dialogue often happens best when it's communion, right? Common mouths gathered around a table talking about things with some good food to eat tends to put everybody in a better state of ease, even if it means you might have to eat some foods that are outside the norm for your culture. When both sides are trying it, it tends to break down some barriers. So thank you for raising that question of food. I wish very much we could all be in communion together, eating together somewhere. I think that would make a huge difference as opposed to these little boxes that we're all in. But Dr. Porter, help us think a little bit outside of that box. what can we do in this era when we are really sort of trapped in digital media? How do we start that dialogue, whether it's with someone who seems to be personally racist or someone who just benefits from systemic white privilege?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, Tim. And I think I, I had an experience teaching a cultural diversity course. And this was one of the most hot button topics.
Mm-hmm.
I was the only African American in the room. Everybody else was a white American. And so the idea of me bringing up the fact that they were privileged because of their skin color drew, as you can imagine, some emotional responses.
Mm-hmm.
Because many of them did not feel privileged, right? And so we then began to get all of the background stories. I was raised in Kentucky, and I was raised in a small town where we didn't have anything, and et cetera, et cetera. So what makes you say that I'm privileged? You're standing here with a doctorate degree, you're a professor at the university, but you're telling me I'm privileged, right? And so it was a very difficult conversation to have, and certainly I did not have all the answers. What I could do, though, is receive what was being said to me, and then try to, as best I could as the leader of the class, to give examples of why there's privilege on one side and what that looks like. And for me, it was an experience that I had when I lived in Washington, D.C., and I came to visit my mother here, and I walked into a store, and it was my mother's birthday. And so we wanted to buy her a very nice backyard patio set.
Mm-hmm.
And so that when my brothers and I walked into the outlet, we weren't greeted with "Good morning, may we help you?" We were greeted with, "We assume you're here for patio furniture." 5 minutes later, the police showed up. We were authentically there for patio furniture. And so this assumption that, that's not something that anyone in that class would ever experience. And so that lends itself to the kind of privilege that we were talking about, right? So it's a difficult conversation, but hey, listen, it can happen. And I think that we need to be vigilant, particularly in a time like this, where we seem to be right on the cusp of going over the cliff.
So on that question of being on the cusp of going over the cliff, I think it leads to a question that many of us seem to be thinking about. Can we as individuals make a difference about this resurgence of white supremacy in our society, or do we need to act in mass? Do we need to bond together in large groups, larger than the 45 people we have here tonight? Tens of thousands in the street, nationwide networks. Can we make a difference as an individual, or do we need that larger social action? Your opinion. There's no right answer to this question. It's totally an opinion question.
My own opinion is that I think the more of us, the better. I think once again, coming back to the Black Lives Matter, you can clearly see the multitude. The multitude has his own dynamic, and he has his own energy and power, which an individual will never ever have. In the same way that I mentioned Belarus, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you have 100,000 people filling boulevards, I mean, I'm sure the dictator looks at that and sort of says, "Boy, I'm in trouble," And so I think the many of us, I think it's almost like going to a church, for example. I think the more spirits are in that huge cathedral, I think the voices that they raise to the heavens. Well, I don't think that God just listens to 1,000 people better than he listens to one person. But I would, if I had talked to him, I think he'd tell me, I think maybe 1,000 voices, are stronger than one. But in any case, my answer is many is better than, yeah. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no. Dr. Porter, what are your thoughts on that one?
I think we had better. That there's no other choice but for us to continue to bring together these social movements. That there is but one voice, no matter how powerful that voice is, or whatever position of leadership they may occupy. We need the masses. We need the leadership to see that this is a central issue and that there are themes around which we are coalescing. And so that brings to bear a specific level of pressure, right? And if there's enough pressure brought to bear, then we will see change. We did not arrive at this point, certainly as African Americans, without having brought to bear change. My only trepidation here is that that was a generation, that was the King generation. We are now in a generation of digital natives. And what is incumbent upon us, certainly as a middle-aged African American, is to again listen to how they feel. Not just listen, but hear what their concerns, and let them lead, guide, and direct. Or rather, let me say this, let them stage the protests, and we can lead, guide, and direct from our vantage points and our experiential backgrounds to advise and consult. But there's no way in the world that we're going to get to the other side, if you will, if we don't bring to bear that kind of pressure. And the only way we can do it is by the masses.
Well, that's a nice point of agreement from both of you, which, you know, as a social scientist or historian, I'll say just because we need the masses doesn't mean the masses don't need us as individuals, right, to join in, because you can't have a mass without some individuals forming it. There's a couple of questions that are coming up from a few different people, and I'm mindful that we're starting to approach the end of the webinar. We had originally scheduled to go till 9 o'clock, but I was told we're going to try to wrap up around 8:30, just so that you don't have to bear the whole world on your shoulders for 2 straight hours. And the questions that are surfacing toward the end of this all have to do around education. What kind of mass movements need to happen around education? How can we come together as American individuals to make a change in the way that education basically launches children on paths to inequity right now? What are some recommendations that you would make one way or the other?
I'll leave that to Dr. Porter, the professor.
Sure. Well, I tell you, I think that there needs to be equity in educational resources. I had the privilege of working in a school district outside of Washington, D.C., a very affluent district. And I was traveling around from school to school, right? And what I was able to witness, and so they obviously had gradations of SES, socioeconomic. You had a large Latino community, large African-American community, large Indian and Asian communities. What I witnessed in that particular school system was complete equity across the board. Every school had the same thing that every other school had. And so whether I was in a middle school or a high school, all of the resources were exactly the same. The computers were the same. The texts were the same. Everything was equal across the board. And you saw that what I witnessed was a level of academic achievement that mirrored that level of equity, right? And so we can no longer have these isolated communities where you have an urban setting where you have an extremely low tax base. You don't have the dollars coming into the district. You lack resources. You don't have computers in a computer age. You don't have broadband. You don't have all these other things, but a school in that same district across town has something else. If we can get to that particular model to make sure that every single school building in a district has exactly the same resources, I think that we move the ball downhill considerably.
So let me ask a follow-up question to you, to that, Dr. Porter, and then I'll go to Dr. Kamau for some thoughts. you're talking about the resources that the schools had, and that's wonderful because that's something I rarely see in my work around the country. Does it matter what the curriculum is in those schools, or are resources a more important move?
Well, obviously, your curriculum is going to matter. If you're talking about culturally biased curriculum and that type of thing, or we're talking about being inclusive and having some level of equity and diversity within it. Now, I am an advocate for throwing out the entire U.S. history textbook and starting over, and telling the truth about all of the individuals and racial and ethnic groups that have contributed to all of what we have. So it's not done turn into a complete whitewash of history. Now that's a resource that I think will make a huge difference. So that if we can honor the Latinx community, if we can honor the contributions of African Americans, if we can honor what Native Americans have contributed and Asian Americans have contributed, and everybody is learning from that, much like we're learning from these textbooks now, that matters. And so I think it's never going to happen, obviously, but it is certainly something that I would advocate, making sure that everybody's story is told so that we can all feel a sense of pride and dignity.
I like that notion of telling everybody's story. I think that's so important as an historian. Dr. Kamau, I saw you smiling a couple times also as Dr. Porter was speaking. Your thoughts on what we can do as individuals massing together to change the education that launches our young people out as American citizens?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to all become advocates of, I think educational advocacy. I think is imperative, because without advocacy, nothing really happens. And then I have another thing which I complain a lot about America, which is why don't we somehow learn to find what's best, what works best, I think, in a big nation like this, and then try to emulate some of that. Because I mean, there are some things that work, there are some systems that work, and it would be so easy to sort of copy some of that. I have an example, which is the Jeffrey Kennedy Harlem school program, in which, for example, I mean, the child is taken not merely as a child, but as a part of a unit. The unit being the family. I mean, you need good education, you need good nutrition, you need good healthcare, you need security. I mean, before you can go to school, I mean, you're not hungry and you don't have an earache or whatever. You know, the point I'm trying to make is that we should find ways to replicate and find that which is best, and which is, because it doesn't have to be expensive, by the way. You know, it can be good and not very expensive. You know, and I would like to sort of see the belief in science, because science is good. Science is what we need to have a good education, a good grasp as a nation of science. I mean, not people who are suspicious of science. You know, and I'm afraid I do not like creationism. I believe in evolution. So, but that's another story.
Yeah. Dr. Porter, I think you were raising your finger for another comment.
Well, yeah, I had a point, and I think it just slipped me. But I did want to say that with school systems and the education community, and one of the things that we might need to advocate for is stability with respect to the scope and direction of the academic programs. Over the course of my public school career, we see a vacillation from one thing to another. So that when I started teaching in the 80s, we were working on Goals 2000. And then we changed to management by objectives. And then we went to No Child Left Behind. And then we went to something else. And so there seem to be these trends that somebody will pull their doctorate dissertation off the shelf and plot in front of the school district and, oh, that sounds like a great idea, so let's move to this ideology. If we stick with what works, back to Kamau, if we stick with what works instead of vacillating back and forth and to and fro and pulling kids from pillar to post, along with teachers, along with principals who become very frustrated because as soon as this superintendent leaves, they're going to bring in another methodology. And so if we can somehow advocate for stability in the curricular focus, that may actually go a long way to fixing many of the problems that we're having in public education.
You're speaking my story. I have lived that same drama in my career as an educator. Superintendents build their careers on turning ships around and going in new directions, right?
That's right.
I want to acknowledge one of our audience members who has really been influential in sort of shaping these questions around education, and I apologize if I get the pronunciation of the name wrong, Shiretta, I'm not sure. But I think we'll wrap up with this series of comments that I'm getting from Shiretta about, the situation is still the case that institutions laced with white privilege, systemic racism, still call the shots in most of our cultures, right? And while we can talk about making an individual action or a mass action to change this aspect of the curriculum or score small victories here, as a closing thought, how do we, this audience and our network of friends that we have, tackle that larger problem of the fact that the odds are stacked against the change that we all seek? So how do we tackle those big institutions, whether it's established universities, whether it's public school systems, big bureaucratic systems that that are working actively against change, even if they're not sort of being fronted by white supremacists with Nazi tattoos? Any thoughts on that as we close, on how we can affect those larger institutions?
Well, I'll jump in with that.
Yeah, and
I've always said, and one of my frustrations in working in large school districts was that I witnessed, and you can probably attest to, that the bureaucracy exists to sustain itself. That there is a suck up, kick down mentality managerially. That you have to follow along in order to get along. You have to go along to get along in this organization. And so if you're one of those with, and I oftentimes say that school districts are where creativity and innovation go to die. Because if you're creative and innovative in a stagnant organization, you're going to become extremely frustrated. And we see that every single year with young teachers. They come in full of hope, vigor, ambition, great ideas, and then get shut down because I need you to go along with what we're doing right now. And if you don't, then now you're going to be evaluated out. And so it is a Herculean, a monumental, almost impossible, although not impossible, almost impossible, to drag behind you a school system of 150,000 students, 20,000 staff members, and heavy administration, the load. So, one individual, sans the superintendent and or the school board, and perhaps that's the group that needs to get the message, right? The school board is the ones who purvey the power. And so if we're going to change these vast organizations, be it the school system or whatever organization, then that governing group needs to be changed and convinced that there needs to be stability and change.
And it goes back to what Dr. Kamau said: if you can run, right, for office.
and I agree. I totally agree with Dr. Porter. But it really comes down to changing the direction of this ship. It's a huge ship. Of state, and it has to change directions almost. You have to have leaders with vision, and true, the individual has a role to play. But let me simply suggest that we need to elect people with vision, people who are going to sort of say the things that the few of us are saying now with a bigger megaphone, you know, of government, of the Senate and the Congress, you know, and Ms. DeVos's office also. So those are they're very, very important. Individuals are important, but I think we need to vote. We need to make sure that we fight at the ballot. It's imperative.
I think that's good advice for closing things out. I will also echo something I heard Dr. Porter say that I think is important, having experienced it many times in my own life. There's a famous video that was made 2000 or so by Derek Sievers, the man who invented Napster, called The Importance of Being the First Follower. When you see somebody stepping up and doing something crazy, what that person needs more than anything else is a first follower. Because otherwise, Dr. Porter is exactly right. They'll be drummed out of the organization. But if they get a first follower, the odds are pretty good that they'll get a few more followers. And it's a lot easier to be a first follower of somebody who is advocating for change and looks like a lone nut standing out there in the street all by themselves than it is to be that first person standing out the street all alone. So consider being a first follower, or what one of our board members, Karen Brass, calls being a stand-upster, right? Somebody who stands up and follows somebody else who's taking the lead, because it's lonely in that position when you're the only one out there standing trying to do something. And I'll close with that thought. First off, I want to thank both of you gentlemen for your excellent insights and commentary. I'm glad I had to do no moderation in terms of like cutting you off or breaking up a spat or anything. I do have a few things to close out the session, but I can't thank you two enough for your participation, and look forward to seeing both of you at a common table over some good food sometime in the not too distant future, where we can recap how this all went. I'm going to go to screen share for a moment for the audience that's left, and I've got a couple of things to close us out. First off, that this whole thing has been recorded, including the chat, and those recordings will be available on the coalition's website, coagg.org, and also with one of our sponsors, the Denver Urban Spectrum's website. And you can see their website there, denverurbanspectrum.com. So the video will be available in both of those places, and we hope you'll check them out. As you can see, we have a few more topics coming up, and I'll have a word about that in a second. But first, it's very important for us as organizers of this conference. You'll receive a short survey in your email, and we would love your feedback on this first event in this series, both in terms of the content and the form of it, in order to inform our thinking about our next topic coming up, which is on October 8th, we'll be taking up the question of dehumanization as an initial weapon of the commission of genocide. And this is actually one of the questions that we spent a lot of time talking about 2 years ago at our first conference that Dr. Porter joined us on. What's in common between, or what kind of practices are in common regarding dehumanization when you're looking at enslaving a people or eliminating a people? They're very, very similar in terms of the way they do this. That should be a really rich conversation, not so much about what we can do as individuals, but about the tactics that are being used against people in our society to make them feel less than human. So that'll be on October 8th. And as Dr. Kamau closed us out, I can't stress enough the importance of every single vote. And it does not matter which direction your vote goes. What matters is that the more people vote, the more that we can say that American society has made a choice, rather than the Electoral College, rather than some small elite group of people, rather than some demographic in the population. And so if you are not registered to vote or are not sure if your registration is current, I'd encourage you to look up govotecolorado.com, or .org, excuse me, which is run by the Colorado Secretary of State. And it will take you to the Secretary of State's page where you can get all your questions about voting answered and know how to register online or in paper. And a reminder that Colorado has a couple of unique things in terms of our elections. One is that you can register on the day of the election up to that date, so there's no rush. And two is that 17-year-olds who are going to be 18 by November 3rd can go ahead and vote in this election with an early mail-in ballot if they want to. They don't have to wait and go vote in person. So Colorado is a great state for voting. We should exercise that franchise. I encourage you all to do so. I'll wrap up by thanking our committee members who put this committee together and our sponsors that you can see below. Many of those committee members are members of the Coalition for Genocide or Against Global Genocide. I got the old name on my tongue for a moment. And I'm really grateful. I was involved in the organization of the first conference 2 years ago. Now I know what a lot of work it was. So thank you everyone on that list for all that work. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Coalition Against Global Genocide. Linda Farb, you're doing a great job filling in for me after I left as chair. I'm so excited to see the way the organization has had major successes. Our longtime executive director, Roz Duman, thank you for the vision and the persistence. And I want to thank our current and other honorary board members, and also anyone who makes a contribution to the organization, because without it, these kinds of events wouldn't be possible. We're also really fortunate to have the support of B. Harris and the Denver Urban Spectrum. And I want to mention that they have a movie night coming up on September 16th that they're sponsoring at 7 o'clock. And you can go to amazonscreenings.com and enter the code What If Democracy Fails if you'd like to see a documentary film about Stacey Abrams and the fight for democracy called All In. And that may motivate others you know to vote if they have not committed to vote yet. So thank you, B, for making that possible and for making this event possible. And last but not least, certainly we want to thank Jewish Colorado for their support of this project in terms of technical support, in terms of advice, in terms of committee help, but also, and very importantly, in terms of the funding for the program. We're deeply appreciative of that support in terms of making this possible. I'd like to conclude by thanking all of you who stayed with us the whole time. I think we kept an audience of about 40 the whole way through, which is a great sign, and invite you to come back and join us again October 8th at 7 o'clock for our second session in this series on What If Democracy Fails, where we will, as I said earlier, take up the question of dehumanization as a weapon in the commission of genocide. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a great evening. And hope you will tell your friends about this and point them to the Urban Spectrum or the Coalition's website where they can watch the video. They missed a great conversation if they weren't here. And thanks again, Dr. Porter and Dr. Kamau. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good night.